as Alex correctly said, in something that, in fact, this conflict, the conflicts in Ukraine, the conflict with Russia, always there's the shadow of China, hovering over them, over the whole thing in the mind of some of these people in Washington. Because you're absolutely correct. The point is absolutely correct. The real obsession is with the fact that China and Russia have now become so friendly towards each other. Right at the start of the administration, there was this extraordinary article written for the Atlantic Council's magazine, which was absolutely ferocious article about China. It already started to talk about Xi Jinping as, a dictator, an enemy of the world, of the United States, all of those things. And in this article in the Atlantic Council, it suggested that the priority must be to try to draw the Russians away from China by making concessions to them. And then you could see the debate, you could almost follow the debate going on within the administration, because then the other side came back and said, look, we can't make any concessions to the Russians. We got to break the Russians instead. And there was an article in the National Interest by a former State Department official. I think his name was Wes Marshall. I may have got his name wrong. But he goes along and says, what we've got to do is we've got to engineer a defeat for Russia in Ukraine. And that will then enable us to basically regain control or gain control of Russian policy and redirect the Russians against China. And he gave the example of how Bismarck, after defeating the Austrians, then basically gained control for Germany of Austrian foreign policy. A completely wrong analogy, by the way. So you could see this sort of debate happening. And that article in the National Interest came out in August 2021. And then, of course, a few months later, we had the war in Ukraine. Now, the war in Ukraine, from the perspective of these people, people who were behind these policies, hasn't gone well. First of all, as Alex correctly said, in Donbass, which is the critical battlefield, Ukraine is clearly now losing. I don't think anybody now is in any doubt about that. The sanctions war on Russia didn't succeed. The Putin government has not been overthrown. Hillary Clinton has now echoed Zelensky. She's come out and said that Putin's inner circle must now remove him. Well, they're not going to remove him. Why would they want to remove him and face massive political problems in Russia if they did a thing like that? And there's no indication that they want to do that. So the game of, detaching the Russians from the Chinese, either by winning them over through concessions or by breaking them, hasn't worked out. So you can see that, you move on to the next stage. You now, instead of detaching the Chinese and the Russians from each other, you conflate them. They become one enemy. And you have all kinds of outliers in the media talking about that. We have in Britain a very, I find a very disturbing British politician, Tobias Ellwood, who is the head of the House of Commons Armed Services Committee. We have one too, and he's the chair of it. And he's now written an extraordinary article in the Daily Telegraph in which he talks about the Chinese-Russian axis. He uses that phrase somewhere, and he talks about how this is the great threat to the world. And of course, he plays out the Chinese weapons to Russia. As Alex correctly says, the Russians haven't, so far as we know, asked the Chinese for any weapons. And at the same time, Wang Yi is present in Munich. People are extremely nervous about his presence, by the way. I mean, that was one of the interesting things about Wang Yi's visit. He goes to Munich. He dominates the Munich Security Conference without actually saying very much. He goes to Moscow. He meets with all sorts of important people there. China publishes a whole series of position statements, including a very interesting one, by the way, about US foreign policy. And suddenly, everybody's talking about China. It's talking about China together with Ukraine. I think the Ukraine crisis ultimately was always about China. And I think the Chinese understand that. And I've explained why. As Alex correctly said,